In the endless sands of North Africa, a boy was born under a weathered tent, a child of poverty, dust, and dreams. No one in that barren land could have imagined he would one day rule his country with fear, wealth, and iron discipline for 42 long years. That boy grew up to be Muammar Gaddafi, a man who promised liberation but built one of the most terrifying regimes of the 20th century. Before we peel back the layers of this brutal rise to power, before we show the truth the world wasn't meant to see, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join Fleek of History. Because in this world, history doesn't whisper, it screams. And some stories are almost too horrifying to believe. The boy from the desert. It all began in June 1942, in a small patch of desert near Sirte, Libya. Gaddafi was born in a goat hair tent, the son of a Bedouin herdsman. His father worked wherever he could find seasonal labor. The family had nothing, no electricity, no running water, no schooling. But they had stories of injustice, of kings and colonizers, of outsiders who stole their land and their pride. By the time Gaddafi could read, Libya was newly independent under King Idris. Yet for most Libyans, freedom looked like a flag but felt like servitude. Foreign soldiers, British and American, still occupied bases across the country. Oil wealth went to outsiders while families starved. That injustice brewed inside Gaddafi like a slow-burning fire. As a teenager, he devoured news from Cairo, where Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser was calling for Arab unity and independence. To Gaddafi, Nasser was a hero, the image of a strong man who could rise from nothing and defy Western powers. He copied his speeches, carried his photo in his notebooks, and dreamed of doing the same for Libya. From soldier to revolutionary at just 19, he joined the Royal Military Academy in Benghazi, the perfect place to start his plot. There, under the noses of British instructors, he quietly gathered a circle of young officers who shared his hatred of the monarchy. Most were poor, disillusioned, and ready to die for a cause that promised to lift Libya out of foreign control. They called themselves the Free Officers Movement, inspired by Nasser's revolution in Egypt. While King Idris grew old and frail abroad, Gaddafi waited for his moment. In the early hours of August 31, 1969, it arrived. While the king was in Turkey for medical treatment, Gaddafi and fewer than 100 men launched a bloodless coup. By dawn, Libya's monarchy was gone. At just 27 years old, Gaddafi seized an entire nation. He appeared on radio, dripping with idealism, claiming the revolution would free Libya from corruption and tyranny. But revolutions, as Libya soon learned, are easy to start and almost impossible to survive. The promise that turned to fear. The young leader refused to call himself president. Instead, he was the brother leader, the guide of the revolution. At first, he was hailed as a new kind of ruler, a man of the people, rejecting luxury and promising equality. Libya's oil dollars began funding schools, roads, and hospitals. The world, for a moment, saw a bold reformer shaking hands with kings and generals. But behind that image, a darker truth matured. By 1970, political parties were abolished. Opponents disappeared. His revolutionary command council became a circle of fear and obedience. Then came the Cultural Revolution of 1973, when Gaddafi ordered ordinary citizens to police each other through neighborhood people's committees. On paper, they gave power to the people. In reality, they turned neighbor against neighbor. By the mid-1970s, Gaddafi released the Green Book, his self-declared Third International Theory. It rejected democracy, capitalism, and communism all at once. Every Libyan student was forced to memorize its pages, while questioning it was grounds for imprisonment. Or worse, he called his nation the Great Socialist People's Libyan Arab Jamahiriya, a mouthful meaning state of the masses. But the only true power lay in one man's hands. The reign of terror as Libyan oil revenue soared through the 1970s, so did the brutality. Public executions became national spectacles. On April 7, 1984, millions watched on live television as 5 students were hanged in front of cheering crowds, mostly schoolchildren forced to attend. Libya had become a country where applause could mean survival. Silence could mean death. His security forces, led by loyal enforcers, built a network of prisons infamous across the Arab world. Abu Salim Prison, Hein Zara, buildings that swallowed people whole. Inside, torture was systematic. Electrocution, beatings, suffocation, isolation. Torture reports filtered out through whispers. Men hanging by their wrists for days. Prisoners executed mid-interrogation, and families receiving death certificates with no bodies. But Gaddafi's wrath didn't stop at Libya's borders. He created the Stray Dogs program, a global assassination campaign targeting Libyan exiles who dared speak against him. In London, Rome, Athens, and Paris, dissidents were tracked down and murdered. More than 24 were silenced between 1980 and 1987. For Libyans living abroad, exile no longer meant safety. Inside embassies, fear reigned too. In April 1984, during a protest outside the Libyan embassy in London, shots were fired from the building, killing police officer Yvonne Fletcher. The world watched, horrified, as Libya became synonymous with state-sponsored terror. The butcher of Abu Salim, June 29, 1996, a date burned into Libya's collective memory. Inside Abu Salim prison in Tripoli, over 1,200 men, political prisoners, lawyers, students, began a peaceful protest demanding better conditions. The regime responded with deceit and bullets. Guards promised negotiations, lured prisoners into open courtyards, then opened fire. Automatic rifles, machine guns, hours of slaughter. The wounded were executed where they lay. Bulldozers later came to erase the evidence, burying bodies in mass graves behind prison walls. For years, no one dared speak. Families searching for their sons were told lies. Some were handed forged documents claiming natural death. Others received nothing at all. Only in the 2000s did the world learn what truly happened, a massacre that rivaled the darkest crimes of the century. Behind the walls of gold, even as prisons overflowed, Gaddafi built a cult of personality as a modernizer and feminist. He introduced laws against forced marriage, hired female advisors, and surrounded himself with an elite all-female bodyguard unit, the Amazonian Guard. Their presence was meant to symbolize empowerment. But it hid something monstrous. Inside his fortress compound, Bab al-Azizia, reality was far worse than propaganda. Witnesses later described underground chambers where women and girls were taken as gifts to the leader. Some as young as 14 were kidnapped from schools or official ceremonies, drugged and assaulted. Many never returned home. Those who did were silenced by threats, shame, or mysterious disappearances. Doctors were forced to sign secrecy pledges. Police never filed reports. Every layer of the state protected the predator at its center. The horror wasn't limited to women. Young men from orphanages and youth camps were also exploited, used as blackmail tools or simply discarded. To speak out was to vanish. While the global media focused on Libya's oil deals and his eccentric speeches, the suffering remained buried, literally and metaphorically. The illusion of reform by the early 2000s, Gaddafi tried reinventing himself again. He abandoned his nuclear program, compensated the families of the Lockerbie bombing victims, and welcomed Western leaders with hugs and handshakes. For the first time in decades, the Libyan dictator was back on red carpets, treated like a partner in peace. But behind locked prison gates, nothing had changed. Reports from human rights groups described scientific torture, prisoners used as test subjects for drugs and chemical exposure. Guards hung men by the wrists until ligaments tore. Women were beaten until they confessed to imaginary crimes. Even Libyan children were turned into instruments of surveillance. Schools required loyalty oaths. Teachers spied on students. Revolutionary committees monitored classrooms. Whispering into ears of the regime, 2010, Gaddafi had created a nation where every eye watched every other, except for one, his own, sitting high in a palace of secrets. The collapse of the regime, then came 2011. The Arab Spring had already brought down dictators in Tunisia and Egypt. When protests began in Benghazi, after the arrest of a human rights lawyer, Gaddafi's fear turned to fury. He unleashed his army on civilians. Marches were met with bullets. Tanks rolled into neighborhoods. Helicopters fired on rooftops. Hospitals overflowed with bodies as snipers targeted doctors. In 1 week, hundreds were dead. By spring, more than 1,000. Television stations played only state propaganda. Phone lines went dark. The internet was cut off. The country had become a living nightmare. When the United Nations finally intervened with NATO strikes, the sky above Libya erupted with explosions. Gaddafi survived the first bombing, but refused to surrender. His speeches were incoherent. Filled with rage, he called protesters rats and swore Libya would burn before he stepped down. And burn it did. The end of the brother leader, by August 2011, Tripoli fell. The walls of Bab al-Azizia crumbled. Rebels stormed the compound, finding luxurious suites above underground torture rooms, blood-stained cells, and boxes of surveillance tapes labeled with citizens' names. But Gaddafi was gone. He fled west toward his hometown of Sirte, surrounded, hunted, and betrayed. By October, NATO jets tracked his convoy. Airstrikes tore apart the vehicles. Gaddafi crawled into a drainage pipe, wounded and delirious, where rebel fighters finally captured him. Moments later, the man who once demanded statues in every square was dragged through the streets he had terrorized. Within hours, he was dead, a fate broadcast to the same world he'd once tried to dominate. His body was kept in a meat freezer, put on display, then buried in the desert, unmarked, unmourned, the aftermath and the shadows. He left when the dust settled. Investigators uncovered a nation built upon lies and violence. Inside government buildings, secret files detailed decades of torture, assassinations, and espionage. Letters ordered killings abroad, lists of exiled Libyans marked for death, accounts of bribes to foreign leaders. Tunnel networks beneath his compound revealed holding cells, medical chambers, and surveillance archives. Some rooms contained personal items left behind by kidnapped women, haunting remains of lives erased. Mass graves appeared across Libya, some containing hundreds of bodies still unidentified today. The regime had fallen, but its poison lingered. Weapons flooded across Africa, fueling new wars. Libya descended into civil war, split by rival factions and blood debts. The law collapsed, and with it, hope for true justice. The children of victims grew up searching for graves that no one would admit existed. Mothers still wait beside empty plots, whispering prayers into the sand. The man behind the mask, Muammar Gaddafi, called himself a savior. He wore robes of gold, spoke of equality and promised freedom. But every smile, every handshake, every eccentric gesture hid a nightmare. What he built in Libya was not a democracy, not socialism, and not revolution. It was control, absolute and unrelenting. Underneath the illusion of progress, torture chambers hummed, bullets silenced dissent, and children disappeared into darkness. The wealth of a nation became the property of one man's delusion. When we study history, we often ask, how do tyrants like this happen? The answer isn't simple. It begins when fear becomes loyalty, when silence replaces truth, then when the promise of revolution turns into the worship of one man. Final message, if you've made it this far. Know this, stories like Gaddafi's aren't just history, they are warnings. Authoritarianism doesn't arrive overnight. It grows slowly behind slogans and symbols, behind speeches that sound like salvation. And by the time the people realize what's been lost, it's too late. So if you believe that truth still matters, hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe to Fleek of History. Because our mission is to remember, not to sensationalize, but to expose the shadows the world prefers to forget.